By the final week of May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force stood on the edge of extinction. What had begun as a confident Allied stand against Germany had collapsed with terrifying speed. Blitzkrieg had torn through the Ardennes, terrain the French command insisted was impassable, and within 10 days German armor was staring at the English Channel. Nearly 400,000 British, French, and Belgian troops were trapped in a shrinking pocket around the small port of Dunkirk, cut off from every route of escape. For the BEF, May 20th was a moment of pure crisis. German forces held Amiens, Arras, and Abbeville, slicing every supply artery the British depended on. Field Marshal Lord Gort saw only two choices: attempt a breakout sure to end in slaughter, or fall back to the Channel and gamble everything on a naval rescue that might never arrive. In London, a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, barely 10 days in office, understood what was at stake. If the BEF vanished, Britain would lose its entire trained army and face invasion with almost nothing left. Even decades later, Churchill would admit he feared this moment would become the greatest disaster in British military history. Dunkirk itself offered almost no mercy. Luftwaffe bombing had shattered the harbor, leaving large naval transports unable to reach the shore. Thousands of soldiers gathered on shallow beaches where destroyers could not approach. Men stood in long, freezing lines stretching deep into the Channel, waiting for rescue under constant attack from above. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, running the evacuation from secret tunnels beneath Dover Castle, realized he needed a different kind of fleet: small, shallow-draft vessels that could nose right up to the beaches. 2 weeks earlier, the BBC had broadcast a request for all privately owned craft between 30 and 100 feet to report for service. The little ships of Britain were being summoned to war. The response was chaotic, patriotic, and in many cases involuntary. Fishing boats from Ramsgate, pleasure craft from the Thames, motor yachts, sailing barges, even lifeboats, were gathered or simply requisitioned. Some owners volunteered eagerly. Others watched in disbelief as the Navy sailed off with their cherished vessels. And then there were the men who refused to let anyone else take their boats into danger. They would go themselves. Among them was a 67-year-old former sea officer living quietly in Richmond. Age would have excused him from everything. Experience warned him away from it. But he had never been a man who stepped aside when others were in peril. His name was Charles Herbert Lightoller. By then, Lightoller had already lived a life so improbable it sounded like fiction. Born in 1874, he had gone to sea at 13 and survived disasters that would have ended most careers: cyclones, fire at sea, shipwreck, severe malaria. During the Klondike Gold Rush, he abandoned sailing entirely, working as a prospector, cowboy, and even riding freight trains across North America before returning to the ocean he could never quite leave. By 1912, he was second officer of the RMS Titanic. On the night she struck an iceberg, Lightoller enforced the women and children first rule with uncompromising discipline, then stayed aboard until the ship went under. Trapped briefly by the suction of the sinking liner, he was blasted to the surface by a surge of hot air and survived on the overturned collapsible lifeboat through a freezing night. He later testified at both inquiries, defending the crew with fierce loyalty. During the First World War, he commanded Royal Navy vessels, rammed and sank a German U-boat, and earned further commendation for bravery. But after the war, civilian shipping had no place for a man forever linked to the Titanic tragedy. Lightoller retired quietly, running a guest house and keeping his beloved motor yacht, Sundowner, on the Thames. By May 1940 he was gray-haired, long retired, and owing the world nothing. Yet the world was not finished with him. And as the crisis at Dunkirk reached its breaking point, the Sundowner, and the man who had already cheated death more times than anyone could count, was about to be summoned back into history. The sea, however, had not finished with Charles Lightoller. Barely had the small boat fleet begun to form when, by May 26th, the crisis at Dunkirk turned desperate. Ramsay's staff needed every vessel that could stay afloat. Naval officers and volunteers spread across the Thames estuary and the southern coast, collecting craft, by persuasion when possible, by requisition when necessary. Sundowner, Lightoller's 58-foot motor yacht, quickly caught their attention. Built in 1930 and meticulously modified by Lightoller over the years, She was the last piece of his old seafaring life. When officials arrived to claim her, he refused outright. No one else would take Sundowner into danger. If she went, he would be at the helm. The Navy protested. He was 67. Too old, they insisted, for a war zone. Lightoller countered that no randomly assigned rating knew the vessel, or the sea, better than he did. Reluctantly, they allowed him to proceed, but only as a civilian volunteer without formal orders or protection. He assembled a tiny crew, his 18-year-old son, Herbert, eager for action, and a young sea scout, Gerald Ashcroft. 3 men, 1 small yacht, and a mission that might well cost all of them their lives. On the morning of June 1st, Sundowner slipped out of her mooring at Chiswick and headed down the Thames. All along the river and coast, Lightoller saw other small craft answering the call. Fishing boats, runabouts, river launches, even a paddle steamer. War had erased distinctions. Every boat, no matter its pedigree, was now part of the same improvised fleet. At Ramsgate, Lightoller received his briefing. The crossing would be deadly. The Luftwaffe dominated the sky, mines choked the approaches, and several boats had already failed to return. Lightoller studied the charts marking the cleared channels. Beyond those lines, he would be completely alone. That evening, as darkness fell, Sundowner pushed out into the channel. The sea was deceptively gentle, rolling softly beneath her hull as Lightoller kept his eyes on the compass. The route was only 39 miles, but every mile carried danger. Magnetic mines, dropped for weeks by German aircraft, waited beneath the surface, ready to detonate under a metal hull. Sundowner's degaussing cable reduced her magnetic signature but offered no guarantees. Herbert scanned the water from the bow. Ashcroft tended the engine. Conversation was almost non-existent. Each man knew what was at stake. Near dawn, the French coast appeared, not as a gray line on the horizon, but as a burning glow. Dunkirk was on fire. Black smoke towered over the beaches, drifting far out to sea. As Sundowner approached, the scale of the disaster came into focus. Tens of thousands of exhausted men packed along the shoreline, stretching into the haze. Some stood waist-deep in the surf, others lay motionless on the sand. Then came the noise, engines, gunfire, explosions, and beneath it all the low, continuous murmur of thousands of frightened soldiers waiting for rescue. Above them, Stukas circled and dived, their sirens screaming. Lightoller watched one attack unfold, bombs detonating among the men below. Yet the lines formed again and again. There was no other choice. He had seen tragedy before, Titanic's final moments, the chaos of war at sea, but Dunkirk was something else. Destruction unfolding without pause, hour after hour. Sundowner surged ahead. Lightoller aimed for the East Mole, the long wooden pier where destroyers and transports loaded soldiers directly. If he could reach it intact, he could take men aboard quickly and escape before German aircraft found them. That was the plan, if the sea allowed him to reach it. The breakwater was still half a mile ahead when the first German plane swung toward them. A Stuka came in low, its landing gear hanging like claws. Lightoller did not flinch. He had survived too much to be rattled now. He watched the aircraft's angle, waited until its dive committed, then snapped Sundowner hard to starboard. The bombs crashed into the sea where they had been moments earlier, throwing walls of water across the deck. The Stuka climbed away, hunting easier prey in the chaos ahead. Sundowner straightened and pressed on. The East Mole was a scene of barely controlled disaster. Destroyers, ferries, tugs, and fishing craft all fighting for space while shells burst around them. Small boats wove between larger ships, dragging men from the water and passing them along like relay runners. Every berth along the mole was packed, and officers shouted conflicting orders. Lightoller ignored the confusion. Spotting a damaged portion of the wooden mole, too narrow for larger vessels, he guided Sundowner into the gap. It was just enough. The soldiers came aboard in a rush. They were starving, sleep-deprived, bomb-shocked, and far beyond orderly discipline. They did not line up, they simply swarmed. Sundowner, designed for roughly 20 passengers, took 50 in minutes. Then 60. Then more. Herbert packed men below decks, filling the cabin and engine space. Gerald tried to count, losing track as bodies pressed past him. By the time Lightoller ordered departure, 127 soldiers were aboard a yacht barely 40 feet at the waterline. The men below had no room to sit. Those on deck lay prone, pressed flat to preserve stability and avoid becoming targets. Sundowner's hull rode so low the channel nearly washed across her deck. One shift in weight, one sharp wave, one glancing bomb, any of it could roll the vessel and drown them all. Lightoller pushed ahead anyway, turning Sundowner toward England. The return would be slower, heavier, far more vulnerable. The three-man crew was now responsible for the lives of 127 exhausted soldiers, many wounded, most barely conscious. His first order was absolute. No one moved without permission. Men below stayed wedged where they were. Those on deck remained flat. Any sudden shift could be fatal. Hardened infantrymen who had survived days of retreat obeyed instantly. They knew leadership when they heard it. Sundowner lumbered forward at a reduced crawl. With her engine straining under the massive load, Lightoller was forced to throttle back, stretching a 4-hour transit into nearly 6. Every added minute increased the odds of discovery. They were found twice. The first attack came less than an hour from Dunkirk when 3 Bf-109s peeled off to strike. Lightoller timed each run, swinging Sundowner sharply the moment the fighters committed, their gunfire slicing the water just behind. The Messerschmitts made several frustrated passes before finally abandoning the attempt. Herbert and Gerald crawled among the packed men, sharing what little water Sundowner carried. Many troops had gone days without a drink. Others bled quietly in the cramped darkness. The second attack was worse. A lone Heinkel bomber, likely returning from another strike, dipped toward them. One bomb could erase the yacht completely. Instead of fleeing, Lightoller steered toward the aircraft, shortening its aim and forcing the bombardier to misjudge the release. The bomb splashed behind them, close enough to shower the deck but not close enough to destroy them. The bomber did not try again. Lightoller kept Sundowner on course. Gradually the smoke of Dunkirk dimmed behind them, and far ahead, through the afternoon haze, the pale cliffs of England began to form. Yet for all that, Lawler never pretended he had altered the course of events. He believed he had merely brought 127 men to safety, nothing more. The nation, however, reached a different conclusion. In the years after the war, the legend of the little ships grew, and Sundowner's voyage became part of the collective memory of Dunkirk. Lawler himself returned quietly to Richmond, content to resume an ordinary life far removed from the headlines he had briefly attracted. Recognition found him regardless. He received a mention in dispatches for exemplary conduct during Operation Dynamo, though he regarded the honor with the same reserve that marked much of his life. His Distinguished Service Cross from the First World War, earned in a conflict that had already scarred his family, held greater personal significance. The Second World War only deepened those wounds. Herbert, who had crewed Sundowner alongside him, survived to old age, but 2 other sons, Roger and Brian, were killed in the early years of the fighting. Lawler endured these losses with the quiet stoicism of a generation shaped by the trenches. He died in London on December 8, 1952, at the age of 78, his life closing with little ceremony. Contemporary obituaries remembered him chiefly as the senior surviving officer of the Titanic, a distinction that overshadowed his later achievements. Only later would his role at Dunkirk gain the broader recognition it deserved. Sundowner, however, continued her own voyage through history. After passing through multiple owners, she was eventually acquired by the Ramsgate Maritime Museum in 2011, where she was restored and placed on public display. Visitors who examine her compact hull often struggle to grasp how she once carried more than 130 people across the Channel under fire. Today, the little ships occupy a central place in Britain's wartime narrative. Their annual gatherings and commemorative crossings underscore the courage of civilians who risked everything at a moment when the nation stood on the edge of disaster. Yet even as the story has grown in symbolic weight, historians continue to caution against viewing Dunkirk as triumph. It was an escape, brilliantly improvised, desperately executed, and made possible only by the determination of those involved. The soldiers rescued from France would fight again across 3 continents, ultimately returning on D-Day to the very shores from which they had once withdrawn. And at the heart of that vast mosaic of endurance sits a modest yacht and the elderly skipper who refused to consider himself exceptional, though history has long since decided otherwise.